Israel is the fruit of American hegemony. It appeared in 1948, very shortly after the American hegemony kicked in. And so, as the American hegemony dwindles, Israel's position dwindles as well. Greetings, this is Eugene the Philosopher, the greatest living philosopher after the unfortunate passing of Quentin Robert D. Nameland, who has been the greatest living philosopher before me. This video is an attempt to make an update of the ongoing war. The ongoing war between Europe and the United States, that is. So, in case you don't know, again, there is an ongoing war between Europe and the United States, but it's a virtual war. Right? And I've had many videos about it previously. I'm gonna link them all in the description. Like, there's a video about Ukraine where I mentioned that. There's a video of how Europe will rule the world, where I mention it, a virtual war, where I mention it, then a video about why Europe needs Muslims, etc., etc. So, I'm not gonna repeat my points here. If you wish, look it up. But now we have a hegemon, United States, and a sub-hegemon, which was previously Britain. But now, like in 2020s, EU will be the new sub-hegemon. So the relationships between US and EU is the key thing in the world for the next 50 years at the very least. While Britain is like on the third row somewhere. British Empire, I mean, British Commonwealth, etc., etc. So yeah, and what we observed today, making this video, I'm recording it on October 12th, right, the Thursday, just FYI. So we are observing recently the widening of the front of the EU/USA war. In particular, like, who is fighting for the EU? Roughly speaking, very roughly speaking, but who is fighting on the side of EU? It's Russia, it's Arabs, right, Eurabia, watch my video about the Muslims in Europe, and China, mostly. These are the main actors. On the side of the USA, however, we have Ukraine, Israel, Taiwan. Then there's also a Korean front, where we have the North/EU Korea versus South/American Korea, right? Well, originally North Korea and China, they were British colonies, right? But now they're kind of playing for the EU. At least a little bit, you know, at least to some degree, even though they're formally still British. I mean, not formally, but you know what I mean. So the Korean front could also reopen at any time. And now the Israel/Arab front is reopening, right? The Arabs are for EU, I remind you, the Israel are for the USA. Then in Latin America, we obviously have socialists who are for EU against nationalists who are for the US in pretty much every country there. And that's why you have constant, like, coup d'etats there, the various rebellions, etc., various wars. So it could also reopen in a major way, like maybe due to drug trade, maybe due to immigration or political turmoil. There could be maybe a civil war in places like Brazil or Argentina, etc., etc. Like, actually, you can look at the map. Maybe I'll put it on the screen right now, where there's currently a ongoing war in Mexico, exactly because of the drug trade. And again, it could spread to anywhere else, really. So the EU/USA war is only accelerating recently, and the fronts are reopening pretty much all over the world. So you may actually call it World War III or IV, depending on your preferences. Maybe you wish to call the Cold War World War III. Then we have a fourth already, right? Okay, there should be as an asterisk here, at some point in the future, when Europe will become the hegemon, or a non-hegemon as I call it, right, against surpassing the US, the current hegemon, there will be, or before that, slightly before that, right, there will be a civil war in the EU as well, where we'll have the South with European skeptics, plus Poland, plus Baltic states, against the North, you know, which is like the EU core countries. And maybe Kaliningrad will play some role here. And watch my video about the splitting of Berlin, where I discuss the problem of the exclaves. Okay, so, oh, we have Myanmar as well, right? Where the Brits are still fighting against the Americans. Okay. So what's the deal with places like Taiwan? Let's talk about this a little bit. Obviously, another hot topic. Well, you see, the United States, again, as I've mentioned in many of my previous videos, one about China, watch the link in the description, by the way. And Berlin, I also mentioned the Chinese issue there. So US tried to get into China since the beginning of 20th century, actually much earlier than that, but especially since the beginning of 20th century, because China was the largest yet unclaimed colonial piece. Okay, but they've failed miserably, right? They failed in Vietnam, through which they wanted to get to China. They failed in Korea, through which they wanted to get into China. Everywhere they faced the British opposition. So now we have the British Korea, the North Korea, the American Korea, the South Korea. We've had the British Vietnam, the North Vietnam, American Vietnam, the South Vietnam, right? Etc., etc. However, okay, they failed militarily. Then, how did Americans want to control the world? Through big tech, and they still do, right? And they tried to control China through big tech. They failed because China has firewall and their own production of whatever they need, all right? So yeah, the Americans failed getting into China. So then they've decided to creep in with some sort of like soft power kind of ideology, like basically build up these American essentially colonies like South Korea and Taiwan to show the Chinese that the American way of doing things is much better, right? You will be richer, etc., etc. So they started pumping money into it, and in particular, they started pumping money into tech industry in these countries. So what ended up happening is that Taiwan and South Korea are one of the largest producers of computer chips, okay? And arguably, you might say, the computer chips are the fuel of modern economy. It's not even the oil or gas or whatever. It's actually the chips. So we arrive at a very shaky situation, where the main tool of American hegemony, which is big tech, is directly dependent on the fuel that is mined, i.e. produced in Taiwan and South Korea, which are in direct artillery range of European colonies, the North Korea and China, right? Like conventional artillery, you don't even need nukes. So it's a very shaky situation for the US as a hegemon. That's the deal with Taiwan, to answer it shortly. So as the American hegemony dwindles, and it's gonna dwindle in the next decades, it becomes shakier and shakier. Like these fuel mines in Taiwan and Korea, they could be in big trouble from the side of European countries. I mean, European colonies, the China and North Korea, and maybe some others, maybe Myanmar's British part as well. So yeah, and notice how it took almost 50 years, almost exactly 50 years, from the start of American hegemony, which was the end of the World War II, to the end, to the peak of American hegemony, which is the unipolar moment, the middle of the 1990s. Well, the end of history was proclaimed, etc., etc. Watch my videos about history, by the way. So 50 years, right? 1945, 1995, from start to peak. Well, we might assume that if it's like a sine wave, then from peak to end, it also would be 50 years. So 1995 plus 50 years is 2045. So that's roughly when we should expect the American hegemony to end. And it's characteristic that the end of the world prophets from the United States, such as Ben Davidson, for example, are saying that the world will end in like mid-40s. They are absolutely correct in this. The only asterisk here is that not the world will end, but the American world will end in 2040s, in the middle of it, roughly. So, yeah. And speaking about Israel, Israel is the fruit of American hegemony. It appeared in 1948, very shortly after the American hegemony kicked in. And so, as the American hegemony dwindles, Israel's position dwindles as well. Like, maybe Israel would disappear by the 2040s. Easy peasy. Maybe, as I've said, like, it's not guaranteed, of course, but again, the correlation is pretty strong. When America is strong, Israel is strong. Alright? And generally, Middle East is will become this sort of a lawless gray zone between larger macro regions, which are Greater India, that's like India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, maybe, and maybe some surrounding countries, maybe even Eastern Africa, included Greater Europe, which will include North Africa and maybe some countries, well, like neighboring countries, let's put it this way. And Sub-Saharan Africa could become its own macro region, but it's still not guaranteed. And the Turkic states, which is a macro region of its own, most likely will be, at least. It will be like this sort of Central Asia, Turkey, like this sort of boomerang-shaped kind of thing. Part of Russia, by the way, Kazakhstan, etc. So yeah, so Middle East will be forever, well, not forever, in the next maybe 70 years, it will be not a very pleasant place to be in, long story short. Okay, so this is the update of the war for now. We're reopening the fronts as American hegemony is slowly dwindling. It will probably end by mid-2040s, roughly 2050. Year 2050, maybe. Actually, maybe it will survive for a bit longer, but we don't really know. So, yeah. But it's a good, like a solid, trustworthy prediction, right? Yeah. And, well, you might argue, well, what about the recent events? Was the Chinese flu part of the war? Well, it could have been. At least it was used by many actors for their own goals within this war. Like, see my video about avalanche model of big events, where I describe how these kinds of events are happening. When many people are interested in an event, it will happen inevitably, pretty much. Like one possible interest in Chinese flu from the elites would be to assassinate the British Queen, which they successfully did, right? She got the flu and she died, essentially. Like, again, it's very strange that the virus kills almost exclusively old people, right? In this respect, etc., etc. And I've also had a short Patreon video about the new normality, where I talk about how lockdowns are or were most likely just a drill. So again, the powers that be were trying to see whether people would comply, and they did. So now we can get back to normal, which we are in pretty much already now in the normal state. But in some time, maybe in a decade or a couple of years, like, you never know, but soon, like 20 years tops, we will face like a full-on lockdown, like just perhaps after the American hegemony would end. Perhaps that would be the case. That actually kind of makes sense, right? The end of the free world. That's what we will face. And another good analogy for this would be women in the workplace, right? During World War II, which was like the Chinese flu war analogy, women were drawn to the workforce almost forcibly, no pun intended. Then they worked there until the end of the war. Then they came back home, and they stayed home for almost 20 years, right? And only then, like in the late 60s, they started working again, but already on a constant basis. Like, they're never going home anymore, at least anytime soon, until society is what it is right now, until we have a birth control pill and things like that, right? So that's what you will face with the lockdowns. We've had this forcible lockdowns, but then maybe 20 years, maybe 10 years, maybe 5 years later, we'll have them on a constant basis, okay? Like curfews and stuff, etc., etc. Then one other thing I was thinking about was the nukes. So last time a nuke was used, notice that when a new hegemon appeared, the United States, previously was British Empire, before the end of World War II. So maybe the changing of the sub-hegemon from Britain to EU would also be signalized with a nuke. You never know. So maybe it's actually like the time is up, boys and girls. I actually don't know, but I have a strong feeling it will be used very soon. Anywhere, actually, on this widening front of Euro-American war. But maybe it will be something different. Maybe some different event will be concocted, so to speak, to celebrate the shifting of the sub-hegemon from Britain to the EU. We've had a global virus already, so it's not probably not happening anymore. I mean, while the footsteps are still fresh, or whatever, however you call it, maybe it's time for a global computer virus. What do you think about that? That would be kind of cool. And the last thing I want to note is, I want to turn your attention to this piece of Masonic humor, right? Freemasons humor. Like, again, I'm recording this on October 12th, so I don't know what's going to happen tomorrow, but supposedly, Jews in many places will suffer, right? At least those were the words of some Muslim people, who have, again, I strongly condemn this, of course, etc., etc., but they've said that on Friday 13th in October, there's gonna be some bad stuff happening to Jews all over the world, okay? And where's the Masonic humor in that? Well, this is the date when, supposedly, according to legend, the Knights Templar were killed, right? Where they were disbanded and slaughtered all over Europe, pretty much. Friday the 13th in October. I don't know, but it's funny. It's funny to me. Okay, thank you for watching. The eons are closing. If you wish to support me, please consider joining my Patreon. That is patreon.com/philosopher. See the link in the description. Or if you have a scientific theory of your own and you'd like my help in developing it, please join my alternative science coaching program, also available through Patreon.